what we're going to talk about, and my guest is kind of right there in line with what we were talking about. I was just telling my guest, and he's a very fascinating gentleman. And he's in studio, and I was telling him that ever since Secretary Bennett, under the Reagan administration, it seems like our United States government wants to get further and further away from education and leave it up to whom I don't know. And former Vice President Joe Biden, he has a new plan that would triple spending on low-income schools, giving teachers a raise and offering universal pre-kindergarten, as well as more for mental health care in schools and work on desegregation. That was based on a recent Vox story. But joining me in the studio is international education speaker and cultural diplomat. His name is Ravi Hutchinson. And he's in town this weekend for something very special. And he has worked with the U.S. Department of the State Department, the State Department. And he is he's very passionate about education. Ravi, welcome to WVON. Thank you.
Thank you, Perri. What a great way to start my visit here in Chicago.
I know. Tell our listeners again why you're here in Chicago.
I'm here. I spend almost 200 days on the road every year traveling around the globe. And a lot of what I do is keynote speaking. And I'm focused on education because I really believe that education can solve all the world's problems. And I think it's so important that we enable kids all around the world to grow up and live their dreams and become good stewards of citizenship, hopefully the same way that my education has allowed me to do those things.
And who are you speaking to with this weekend?
Yes, I'm speaking to the HWC Leadership Institute, Executive Leadership Institute here. They're hosting an aspiring school superintendents conference, and they've asked me to be the keynote. And the education powerhouse, Britannica, we know them from the big brown books, but now they're doing all sorts of things in digital learning. They've made it possible for me to come out here and address this group.
And you're saying the majority of them are African Americans that want to aspire to, expand their careers in education, reach different heights, like being superintendents of districts and schools and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I've been told that this particular conference has that focus and that there's a real need for it. A real need for that kind of focus in order to help elevate this particular sector of the education leadership into those really powerful and influential positions.
Well, let me just be very honest. And I'm not saying that Vice President Biden does not think that by any means that he doesn't believe that African American children and people of lower income on the lower status should be educated. But it appears to me that there are so many other people. I'm like the Betsy DeVos's and, just different districts of how the disparities of the schools that get the money and the schools that don't. And if you look at what's going on in the South, which is absolutely deplorable, how these kids are being educated. Is this not a lofty goal of the loftiest of goals?
Yes, it is, and probably one of the most important. Though this is something we do need to solve. You asked the question at the opening here. Is our government getting out of the education business? And it is. It certainly is focused on. Unlike other developed countries that are trying to get more into the education business, our country is doing what we often do. We try to privatize things. And certainly under the current administration, there's a huge push and focus for school choice. And there's a lot of good arguments as to why it works, but there's also a lot of good arguments as to why it doesn't. And, I believe we should be not diverting our funds out of public education into these charter schools, for example, some of which are for-profit. And I believe that we should be really investing in public education because what I always tell my audience audiences is that the most important skill for the future is cultural competence. And if we have
what does that mean?
Yeah, so cultural competence is really, in the most obvious sense, it's being able to understand people cross-culturally.
Yes.
And when we define culture, it's not just geographic culture.
But that's not the business of the United States.
Oh, no, what I was just going to say, it's not just geographic culture, but it's socioeconomic culture, it's generational culture.
That's
culture
right.
works in all different directions. So when we're going to make kids who are culturally competent, because our kids, it may not be the business of the United States, but our kids are going to grow up to be global citizens.
Right.
And if we are going to prepare them to take on the world and to be world leaders, we need to make sure that they can uncover their own implicit biases, which we know we have to deal with in the United States, like most countries do, but also then start to recognize those common bonds that they have with people who are unlike themselves in order to create building blocks to bring our country and the world forward, all of humanity. So it's a lofty goal.
It is a lofty goal.
But it's a big one, and then it's an important one.
So in the last segment, we were talking about an article that was in Essence magazine, essence.com, and it was talking about the name of the article was Joe Biden is the white moderate that Dr. King warned us about. And you do understand while people are on the lower socioeconomic stratus and black people, I'm not even talking about anybody else, I'm talking about black people, why they're so distrustful is because we are the direct targets of implicit bias. We're the original targets of implicit bias. And what it's done, it has destroyed opportunity, it's just destroyed our wealth, legacy wealth, all of that, education. And guess what? In spite of all of that, many of us did very well. I went to great schools. I had my mother was an educator. And most middle class families in Chicago at one time, their parents were educators because those were the only jobs that they can get. But it also kept them in the so-called middle class. I remember a time, and I talk about this all the time, my mother was the consummate teacher. She loved education. She loved her students, and she was won all kinds of merits for her teachers. I teach here on the radio. Oh, it was fantastic.
Yeah.
But and I often get a little teary-eyed because I was very jealous of her relationship with these kids, but I understand today now how important it was because that was her purpose.
Right.
And so at that time, the Chicago public schools, over 70% of your teachers and administrators were African American. We're down to 21%. So if they're not people that understand us or understand these children, their culture, understand that that they have some social issues in the homes, whether it might be, you can't, their basic needs are not met.
Absolutely.
You do, right?
Yeah. Well, so
needs.
there are a couple of things here. I mean, so a lot of things you brought up there.
I could talk to you forever.
I know. And, we'll have to break out the coffee after this.
Okay.
But, what you just said was so important. Now, your mother was a teacher. You said you teach on the radio. Of course, I'm not an academic either, but I teach as a public speaker.
That's right.
We're all teachers. In some senses, we're all teachers, and we all have that responsibility and that opportunity to shape the minds of the next generation. Mm-hmm. Now, the other thing you talked about in addressing some of those issues, one of the great things about the millennial generation is that they are the most multicultural generation that we've ever seen. And this is our incoming teachers now we're talking about, not the students. But this is also true of the next generation, Gen Z. And they are the most multicultural generation that we've seen, and they are almost, in a way, organically defeating some of these implicit biases. You got to remember, the baby boomers, many of them grew up during a time of segregation. But the millennials grew up at a time of Obama. Mm-hmm. And they're not impressed that we had an African-American president. They think it's normal. And actually, that's that's progress. You know, when we look at it that way, it's really progress because we are, in some ways, organically growing out many of these things.
But look, I don't mean to interrupt you.
No, go for it.
But they're playing video games with people from all over the world.
Yeah.
You know, Indians and you know, and the Chinese and Japanese.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got my godson, he's just out of college. I'm amazed at who his friends are.
You know, Perri, it's amazing. I started a program that really kicked off last year called Ravi Unites Schools.
Okay.
I have a global network of over 100 schools, and I use the internet to create Skype, basically, to create online interactions between students in India, students in China, students in the United States, students in Canada, students in Chile. And we have these 45-minute conversations online with student groups on each side, and they run the questions. The kids are talking. We're talking peer-to-peer learning, and they are learning about each other. What I'm able to do with this program is really get right into their innate organic curiosity and give them that space. This is what education needs to do. Give them that space to use that curiosity to discover things about each other. And you know what they all do? It happens every time. They're all playing the same video games. And
Minecraft?
Yeah, Minecraft and Fortnite and all these things that some of them I don't even know, right? But they find this common bonds through video games, through music, through books, through movies, through pop culture. It all comes back down to culture. And if we have that cultural competence, I'll say it, Perri. I'll say it on the air. I think we're on a path to world peace. I really do.
Well, listen, when we come back from the break, I'm actually going to get to some of these questions that you suggested. But I'm a little stubborn sometimes. I mean, because there's so many things to talk about. It's 10:47 on the Talk of Chicago. We've been talking to Ravi Hutchinson, and he's just really an amazing man. He's in Chicago for a conference. He's the keynote speaker. And we're going to talk about all of these things when it comes to education when we come back. And since you travel the world, and you travel 200 days out of the year, I want to find out what developed nation has education right, who absolutely has all of this right. We'll be right back. Stay with us. And we have been talking to education expert Ravi Hutchinson, and we're talking about mostly how big spending on low-income schools impact America's education system. And I'm a little bit cynical because, you know, we're here in the city of Chicago. Mayor Rahm Emanuel closed 50 schools in the most distressed neighborhoods in the city of Chicago, and he was able to get away with it. And then after that, the National Teachers Academy, which was a level 1+ school operating in the South Loop, they wanted to, it's a predominantly African American school that's working, where the kids are actually learning, but they won that fight. They're able to keep the school open for those students instead of opening a high school for more affluent students. So that's the issue. I mean, you know, money is always a big issue, Ravi, on who gets the resources. But tell me the developed country or countries that are getting it right when it comes to education.
So I'm going to answer that question by addressing the what you just talked about.
Okay.
It's really interesting. When you look at the United States on the PISA test results, that's the Program for International Students Assessment. Okay, that's how we rank all school systems across the world.
Okay.
And when you look at the United States, we fall right in the middle, but we're the United States, right? We should be up at the top. We shouldn't be falling in the middle. But what's interesting is if you look at that, if you look deeper into those statistics and you remove the schools that have more than 25% of students getting Title I funding, meaning that they're on free and reduced lunch. We're essentially saying you remove the schools that have more than 25% poverty. We are up there in the top. We're competing with the other countries.
Really?
Yeah, and that's what's interesting because we don't look at that. So in some ways, I'm going to have to answer your question by saying when I look at an education system of developed countries, who's got the best? We do. We actually don't have an education problem, in my opinion, in public education in America. What we have is a poverty problem. And until we address that poverty problem, that segment of the population where we're not addressing poverty it's a huge challenge to educate them.
Well, what is the impact of poverty in education?
Well, there's a lot of things. First of all, there's family dynamic. Families are the first educators, and when you have impoverished families who have survivalist needs, honestly, it's hard to focus on the end game, on the long-term vision of the return on investment of education. And poverty is a cycle too. You know, I'm a partner. I partner with a boarding school in India where we educate the poorest of the poor. We take them out of the villages at the age of 4. We pay for their education up to their master's degree. And we've had the school for 20 years, and these kids are working at Fortune 500 companies now. So we know that if we address the poverty issues, and we have to get in there early, that's why we get them at the age of 4, where we can affect their brain development through nutrition. That's how real poverty is. Then we can we can actually give them a fair chance at gaining the proper education that's going to enable them to live their dreams. And you take a country like India, 500 million at or below the poverty level.
Right.
It's a huge number.
Right.
But there's 1.4 billion people there, right? There's 4 times the population that we have here. Yet the country's 1/3 of the physical size. You can't hide poverty in India.
And then you don't have a lot of, and everyone is not educated in India. I mean, it has access to education.
That's right. Yeah, access to education is a huge problem. But that's a problem here too.
Yeah.
And that's what's amazing. In the United States, we have a poverty problem that we're able to hide. You can't see it because we're a big country with fewer people. But it's there, and every listener needs to know that it's there. And this is
I think WVON's audience knows that it's there.
Do.
And listen, this audience is some of the more affluent audience, but we are very aware of of this. This is interesting. What are some of the things within Joe Biden's plan that may not work as intended in his education plan?
I think the hardest thing that I see in looking at the plan is, he's pretty committed to making sure that the funding doesn't go to for-profit institutions and for-profit schools. And that's really important. But it's very hard to see. Even just this morning, I think huge headway was made in West Virginia for starting charter schools there. So we have to make sure that there is a reverse in this trend. And when I mean a reverse in the trend, it's not necessarily not allowing charter schools, but if we do, there has to be the kind of oversight and accountability that we expect from our public education sector. Because otherwise, and I use this term knowing that it's controversial, but otherwise, school choice is just self-selecting segregation.
Absolutely.
And
I agree 100%.
We're pushing our country backwards if we are pushing for self-selected segregation. It doesn't make sense, and it's not good for our students.
But there's some efforts to actually do that in some places of the South right now.
Of course, yeah.
I mean, they rather than integrate their schools, they come up with these different and very creative plans that will still segregate students.
So here's the thing to think about, Perri. PricewaterhouseCoopers tells us that 38% of jobs are going to be automated by the next 10 years, the next decade.
Right.
So if we're no longer defined by our jobs and careers, what are we defined by? We're defined by who we are. We're defined by how we get along with other people. And if we segregate ourselves and out of inclusion, if we go that direction, I don't care how privileged you are, and I come from a privileged background, I have a deficit if I have to be able to be culturally competent and work with people in all socioeconomic levels, because I'm no longer going to be defined by my job and career.
Okay, you're so privileged, but you know what? You interacted with me with my impoverished stuff.
That's cultural competence.
That's cultural competence. 10:58 on the Talk of Chicago. Ravi, this was fascinating. Let me know when you're able to, or let Sonia know when you're able to talk to us again, and we can do it by phone.
I would love to come back after doing this conference, because I'll have a whole new perspective on what African American.
When is the conference?
The conference is on Sunday in
Sunday.
Naperville. Yeah.
Oh, Naperville.
Yeah, it's in Naperville.
All right. Well, that's pretty privileged too.
Yeah, it is.
Thank you very much for being with us. I know you're going to have a great success. And what you guys don't know is that Ravi, you actually used to work with the rock band Hanson.
I was a guitar player. Yeah.
You remember those 3 very good-looking young white males that looked like girls, and the girls went crazy. They were huge, and that's what your background is.
And one brown guy.
And one brown guy. Yeah, Ravi.
Well, your listeners can learn a lot more about me at RaviUnites.com, and they'll get the whole history and my blog about my thoughts on education and a whole lot more there.